Be. Anywho, also this morning, former President Trump will be back in court today for his criminal hush money trial. We'll have a preview of what to expect on that. Also new this morning, Fox News facing another threat of litigation almost a year after the network agreed to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to Dominion Voting Systems.
And this challenge coming from Hunter Biden.
Yeah. He is, I guess, considering a lawsuit. They made an announcement about it yesterday. We'll tell you the very latest.
Well,
on
and the
that.
OAN had to settle, Willie, with Michael Cohen for lying about him. It's almost as if people like Rudy Giuliani and that InfoWars guy and all these other people are learning that, well, defamation laws still have bite in America. You can't just make up stuff about other people and just run it on your network.
Yeah, there's a cost to it. OAN had to retract a story about Michael Cohen. We know that almost $1 billion, that settlement that came down against Fox News, perhaps left a mark, and that they will now be dealing with another lawsuit from Hunter Biden. Who knows what the number will be there. But yeah, there are consequences to spewing false information out into the atmosphere, and it's good to see some people now starting to hold news organizations that just make stuff up in the interest of politics to defame people are being held accountable.
Well, make stuff up and then refuse to retract them when it's brought to their attention that they were wrong. I mean, we'll see what happens in the Hunter Biden's case, but we've seen time and time again, Rudy Giuliani still going around, I think, lying about, conspiracy theories and everything else. It's just goes on and on, but it is it's pretty crazy. You look at, again, all of the false information, and again, it's all, like we've said, it's almost as if gravity's returned. Speaking of gravity returning, I hear, Willie, to Madison Square Garden.
Oh.
And in fact,
where's he going with this?
No, where I'm going is you got the Knicks, you got the Rangers, you got, it had been floating in the stratosphere of irrelevance since about 1971. Looks like things are about to get crazy there.
George, that home, they win Game 6, then it's this high-stakes Game 7. So hoping the Knicks can close it out tonight, and I fully expect the Garden to be at its very best.
All right, along with Joe, Willie, and me, we have the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. He's the author of the weekly newsletter Home and Away, available on Substack, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, Eugene Robinson, is with us as well this morning. And we begin this morning with the growing unrest at Columbia University. Overnight, people protesting Israel's war against Hamas occupied a campus building, the same one students took over in the 1960s. The building is just a few hundred feet away from the Gaza encampment site. And now the university is urging people to avoid coming to campus today if they can. The protests escalated just hours after the university began suspending students who refused to leave the encampment. The tents have been up for nearly 2 weeks, and the university wants to clear it before graduation on May 15th. The protesters held a press conference yesterday afternoon saying the university has not made significant concessions to their main demand. The group wants Columbia to divest from companies with links to Israel. The students also claim Columbia has stopped negotiations. As a result, they say they will, quote, not be moved unless by force.
Meanwhile, protests escalating at other college campuses as well. The University of Texas, protesters clashing with police there, resulting in dozens of arrests. Video shows officers in riot gear dragging, carrying out demonstrators. The university says at least 40 people were taken into custody yesterday for trespassing and disorderly conduct. Many of them were not affiliated with the school, a phenomenon we're seeing at many of these campuses. Meanwhile, at the University of Utah, police were called to disperse a crowd of protesters. The university says 17 people were arrested last night. One officer was injured. A hatchet was confiscated there. The number of arrests at campuses across the nation now approaching 1,000. Let's bring in the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. Eugene Robinson, also writing about this, visited the campus of George Washington University yesterday. So, Gene, I want to get your impression first of what you saw. GW been one of the flashpoints in these college campus protests over the last 2 weeks. What did you see in your reporting yesterday?
Well, I got there at a pretty quiet moment. The night before had been a very loud moment. On Sunday night, the protesters essentially, there was a small encampment on the university yard. The authorities had surrounded it with barricades. They actually had asked the D.C. police to clear that small encampment on Friday night, and the D.C. Metropolitan Police said, no, we don't think that's a great idea. So they didn't do it. So it was still there. And then on Sunday night, the students had torn down the barricades and rushed in and put up a whole bunch more tents. So it was a larger encampment, but it was very quiet when I was there, actually, in the morning. There were some of the protesters were asleep. Some were sitting outside of their tents, apparently cramming for finals. And so when I was there wasn't any chanting, there wasn't any shouting. There haven't been the kinds of conflictive sort of encounters at George Washington that we've seen at some of the other universities. And so the administration's trying to figure out what to do, but it's a stalemate, as it is on. I think there are protests at more than 50 campuses around the country right now.
You know, Gene, I think it may be the only time in your life you struck a Nixonian pose that morning. You remember the story of Nixon wanting to go out and understand the anti-war protesters, so he got there so early in the morning wearing his dress shoes that they were still asleep at the Lincoln Memorial, and Nixon tried to talk to him about USC football. It really didn't connect with the kids that way. What do you think? I'm curious what your thoughts are. I had a lot of nice, wonderful, well-intentioned people that watched this show, loved this show, write me yesterday, and I wrote a lot of them back, called one or two back, saying, you know, the sense of anti-Semitism on college campuses and social life, and I will tell you, I know firsthand from friends and family members that Jews are being pushed to the side socially, and that woke white girls and boys coming from elite families are telling their friends that they can't hang out with Jewish friends, and I could go on. And maybe one of the reasons I was as engaged as I was yesterday is I've been hearing about this now for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, where Jewish students don't feel safe on college campuses. And this isn't a bubble wrap or snowflake moment. This is people talking about genocide, screaming at them as they try to go to their English class on campus. So what do we do, Gene?
Well, look, the anti-Semitism is intolerable. It is awful, and it is going to wreck, to destroy the movement and prevent any sort of chance of them achieving any of their aims. And I'll get to the aims in a minute, but it's crazy, and it has to stop. And again, when I happened to be there, I didn't witness it. There hasn't been that much at George Washington of that sort of thing, but then again, not every protest is alike. And I know I've seen some of the video and some of the scenes and some of the audio from Columbia and from some of these other protesters, and it's horrible. It's atrocious, and anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism is going to be a central element of this movement, then it deserves to fail, and it will fail. But what I saw and what I think we're seeing in polls that have been taken and this and that is something of a generational shift in overall sort of attitudes and impressions of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and we've seen polls showing that younger adults, 30 and under, are much more sympathetic to the Palestinians than older groups, and perhaps they are less aware of history. They seem to be very confused about how and why the state of Israel was founded and this and that. But but this is real. I mean, this is being shown in poll after poll, and these kids grow up, and so I think it's something that we ought to pay attention to in sort of that macro lens.
You know, Willie, the thing is, and I'm certainly not saying this of all the student protesters that are out there, and certainly not children of Palestinian families who have lost loved ones through the years in this war, in this conflict. I will say, though, again, and I've spoken with some of them, I want to be careful, but among these white, woke, pampered, elitist, I'm not supposed to use that word, let's say children from wealthy families that decide, as Dr. Brzezinski said so many years ago, that they're going to play radical for a weekend and then go home to mommy and daddy's mansion. There's a complete ignorance about the complexities of this issue. Now, of course, if you listen to this show, you would understand many of the complexities of this issue, because we have been really tough on Israeli officials that come on this show. We have asked why they've continued to allow illegal settlements in the West Bank over the decade, why they have continued to fight against a two-state solution for peace, why they have done what they've done in Gaza, why they did with Hamas, why Netanyahu was Hamas's ally leading up to October the 7th. So it's very complicated. That's lost, though, and a lot of those things. And when you start talking about even West Bank settlements with a lot of these students, their eyes glaze over. Because that's not in the TikTok video. And again, I'm not saying this about all the students, but I will tell you, I'm saying about a hell of a lot of students I have spoken with. When you go, well, you know, in 2000, there was an Oslo Accord where Bill Clinton had gotten together and they were giving 97% of the West Bank to the Palestinians, and the other 3% they were going to make up with Israeli land, and they had figured out a capital in East Jerusalem, and they sit there with their eyes glazed because they have no idea.
And that means the elimination of the state of Israel and the people who live within that state. So I've been having a lot of these same conversations as you, Joe. So if you watch our show, you know how critical we've been of Netanyahu, of the prosecution of the war, that we grieve and mourn for children and women who have been killed in this war, that are starving in this war. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But that does not give kids on college campuses license to chant from the river to the sea and to say that Jewish kids should not exist in some cases, at Columbia, for example. So, Jonathan, from your point of view at the ADL, what are you hearing? I mean, you've brought us a great look at the Jewish experience since October 7th, but right now, in the midst of these protests, what is it like to be a Jewish student on the campus of not just Columbia, but University of Texas? There are a whole bunch of schools.
It's the right question, Willie. You know, I was at UCLA on Sunday. I was at USC on Friday talking to Jewish students. I was at Columbia last week. And let me tell you, I don't know exactly what Eugene saw at GW in terms of these tents, but I've talked to students from all these universities, and they don't feel afraid. They are with good reason. Right? And I mean, as mentioned in the opening here, you had someone with a hatchet at University of Utah. You had students with hammers who broke into the building at Columbia last night. You had someone with a sword at UCLA on Sunday, this isn't normal. People showing up fully concealing their faces like they're ISIS fighters, that isn't normal. And I heard from kids again and again and again, they are leaving campus, they are moving out of their dorms because they are worried. At Columbia, of course, President Shafiq, she had to close classes. I don't know if people realize this. Classes are over at Columbia. They all went remote because the administration was so afraid of these people. I see these videos. I see these images of mass protesters breaking into buildings, barricading them with furniture. And look, I'm reminded of January the 6th. That's what this looks like to me. I mean, we talk at ADL about right-wing extremists, about masked Proud Boys showing up at school board meetings, about Oath Keepers wearing masks. I look at this, and this is what I see. And let's be clear about one thing. The students who are doing this, the groups behind it, SJP, Palestinian Youth Movement, their response to President Shafiq's offer last night was, Columbia will burn. I mean, these students, we shouldn't treat them like children when they're hardened activists.
Well, they're adults, and go ahead.
No,
so
I was just going to say this is it's one half about the students. It's also about, Mika, these authorities and the lack of them. Why are these school administrators, why are they abdicating their responsibility to this degree? And this affects students, it affects outsiders, it affects teachers with tenure. The last I checked, tenure is supposed to give you intellectual protection so you can say things in classrooms. It doesn't, it seems to me, give you the ability to break the law with impunity. And I just don't understand what's... And you see also the difference on the campuses between what's happening on some, Chicago and Florida, as opposed to what's happening at Columbia and others. There's an enormous gap in the principle and backbone we're seeing here.
Well, Richard, to your point, I think that's where that's the place we've all been sitting in watching this, going, what the hell is going on? What are these universities doing? Why aren't they doing something? And I'll echo the horror that this does look like January 6th. What a terrible example for our students. At the same time, these are young adults, and the question is, why do you choose to learn about the complexities of other situations around the world, but this one, you want to set up an encampment. This one, you want to scare people. This one, you want to come to the edge of violence or even go to violence.
Not the
this
edge.
one,
They're
you risk your future and your education for. See, I think these college students obviously are missing the part where they need to see what's going on across the country with these protests. That it's now in the realm of violence, it's in the realm of hatred, whether some are peaceful or not. They need to watch the news and look at all the different arguments and be adults, or start learning to be adults and set up discussions and debates across college campuses, or their colleges or universities are going to have no choice but to expel them and ruin their future, the impact they want to have on the community, society, and the world at some point. But let's then go to the hard part of this. What is the solution for college university presidents and deans who want to maintain control but also preserve free speech? What are solutions? Let's talk about solutions.
It's very simple. First of all, you enforce the rules of your college campuses. There is a concept.
Well, but you know that at this point would be hard to do.
Well, no, actually, what?
Well, I'm just saying, you go out there and you start arresting people.
Yeah, you do. You either follow the law, you don't follow the law. There's a concept.
I don't think it's that simple.
In the First Amendment. No, I will say, I understand over the last 24 hours what the Columbia administration has been trying to do. They've been trying to bring this to a peaceful resolution. And what happened? People got hammers and they broke into buildings. At that point,
that's a crime.
At that point, that's a crime. Tragedy and the suffering over the decades. And so I am not one to be able to sit in judgment of them. But I can sit in judgment of school administrators. What do you do? What do you do in a situation like this? You stop the law breaking. You make your campus safe for everyone. For everyone. For everyone. You don't allow these protesters to take the campus over themselves and say, this is our viewpoint. We are going to scream. We are going to set up encampments. We are going to dominate this debate, so you only hear our side. And the louder we scream, the more self-righteous we feel.
That's what they're doing.
The idea of colleges, Willie, the last time I checked, for at least when there still were liberal, there's sort of a liberal tradition of learning at places like Columbia, you actually have discussions. You actually pursue the truth, not your truth, not the truth you're feeling. You try to pursue the truth, what the truth is. And if you can't get to the truth in a place like Israel, then what you do is you talk through it and you try to work towards peace. You try to work towards a two-state solution. Now, people say, and I've heard this from students on college campuses, oh, you can't even bring up a two-state solution because they say that's a Zionist conspiracy. Peace for the Palestinians is a Zionist conspiracy? Go take these pictures down. I want to talk to Willie. Willie, who's learning? Who's learning by these images that we saw? Who's learning more about the Middle East? Who's learning about the illegal settlements on the West Bank set up by Netanyahu? Who's talked through a discussion with, let's say, Jewish students to say, you understand your government's been illegally setting up settlements in the West Bank, making a two-state solution next to impossible, while cynically aligning with Hamas because you want to undermine the people who don't want to wipe Israel off the map because they're the biggest threat to a two-state solution. And if you get both sides talking together, you would find out that Hamas and Netanyahu both are enemies of a two-state solution. So maybe that's why they were working together to divide people in Israel, to divide people in Gaza, to divide people in the West Bank, and to divide people on college campuses. And then you ask the question, okay, so we understand there are people who are enemies of peace here. What do we do to outthink them? What do we do to outmaneuver them? How do we move toward peace? Because that's what this should all be about, not virtue signaling or screaming or breaking into buildings. But for that to happen, people that run universities can't allow anarchists to take over buildings, to use hammers to break into buildings. Now, people say, oh, you can't do, yeah, you can enforce the law. You can enforce the law, and then you can start classes again, and then you can begin teaching students, like having discussions with students, talking about the horrific complexities that have surrounded this argument, this debate since 1948. And then maybe you learn something. We kind of think that's what colleges are about, not getting hammers and breaking into and occupying buildings at Columbia University.
Joe, your analysis is sophisticated, thoughtful, and more than an inch deep, so it's just not going to work. I'm afraid.
Won't work.
It was too thoughtful there. But I will say, for all these images we've seen and been discussed and advised, those conversations are happening. I can speak for my own school, Vanderbilt. We had the chancellor on last week. You guys have talked a lot about Dartmouth, where they're having these discussions. They're bringing in an Israeli ambassador and somebody, the head of the Palestinian Authority, and they're explaining their sides, and they're having a civil debate, and no one has a hammer, and no one's yelling.
Great.
They're giving people places on campuses to protest. And then, in the case of Vanderbilt anyway, when they stormed into a building and broke a window and pushed a security guard aside and sat there for a day, the students were suspended. They looked individually at all their cases, and they expelled a handful of them. So we've given you all these outlets, Jonathan. We've given you places to have these conversations, which is what college is supposed to be. You don't have to pick a side, just listen to the debate.
Totally.
But, I mean, do you think any of the people in that building at Columbia right now actually want to have that conversation?
Look, President Shafiq needs to, deliver consequences, not make concessions. Chancellor Diermeyer at Vandy is an example of just a leader with moral clarity. That's your alma mater. My alma mater is Northwestern. President Michael Schill actually gave into the protesters yesterday at Northwestern, inexplicably, literally making
that are occupying buildings and making the campus unsafe were the same ones that missed their high school graduations because of COVID. Again, the selfishness, it's extraordinary that they have to shut down campuses when, in fact, there are ways for them to get their message across.
Of course there are. And keep in mind the numbers. The numbers. Columbia has 30,000 students. You know how many are in this encampment, Joe? It's like 200. So we're talking about 0.7%. Same kind of numbers at Northwestern or all these schools. This is a fringe between literally like 0.6 and 1% of all of the students. And I would say one other point that's really important. You know, not all Jews look like me. There are plenty of Jews from the Middle East at USC on Friday. I heard from an Iranian Jewish student whose parents fled the Islamic Revolution, who's basically been told, you can't be part of the Middle East North African group because you're Jewish. He is more from the Middle East than many, if not most, of these people. He grew up hearing Farsi in his home as his first language. But you know what? To these kids, because he's Jewish, you know, he's not part of the crowd. That is racism, plain and simple. And so, look, much like you were talking about Hamas earlier, and I'm sure Richard will talk about it in a bit, Israel keeps offering them concessions, making offers on hostages, and they refuse. And these demonstrators, these activists, they get offered concessions by the universities. And look at what's happening at Columbia right there. They simply refuse to accept because it seems like their goal isn't to come to some conclusion. It's about what's better for the Palestinians. It's just to reject Israel, to reject their Jewish peers. Again, that's racism, and it's wrong.
Well, and Jonathan Lemire, there was a Columbia student that was quoted, and that was UCLA, I believe. There's a Columbia student that was quoted in the New York Times yesterday who said, I support a ceasefire. I really wanted to go in, and I wanted to be with the people that were protesting for a ceasefire. But basically, it wasn't about a ceasefire. It was about the end of Israel. And because I support Israel, they told me the existence of Israel, not what Israel's doing, the very existence of Israel. Because I supported the existence of Israel as a Jew, but because as a Jew, I also supported peace and a ceasefire and the end of the war in Gaza. They told me that because I didn't want Israel to be eliminated from the face of the earth, I was not allowed to be part of their protests.
Yeah, we had Mayor Eric Adams in New York City on yesterday, who said it was a mix of student protesters as well as outside agitators. And he was clear to say most of the students peaceful. They were there on campus. It's the outside agitators who are causing most of the trouble in hurling the violent rhetoric. And we're not sure who yet has occupied this building, Hamilton Hall, the main academic building at Columbia. It's also the site of the major Vietnam War protests of the 1960s. We should also note Columbia University has put out an alert this morning telling students and personnel to stay off campus today because of what's happening there at Hamilton. And certainly there's a place for peaceful protests. There shouldn't be any anti-Semitism, any anti-Arab or Muslim rhetoric.
Jonathan, this is your college. Jonathan, who allows this? Who allows students to take over? I mean, again, this is not, I tell you, this happened at Vanderbilt or University of Alabama, it would be over. It would be at Alabama, my God, it'd be over in 5 minutes. Like, who allows students to break in illegally into buildings and occupy buildings?
What Columbia does is, we should note, Columbia is proud of its history of protests. You know, that's part of who Columbia is. That said, of course, it seems like the administration has made clear this has crossed any number of
Keep
lines.
kids away from Columbia. You're saying it's part of Columbia's storied history to allow people to go in and illegally break into buildings.
To protest peacefully.
No. They're proud of illegally breaking into buildings and taking over presidents' offices in the 1960s, and you would think if that hung over them for 50 years, they would have been better prepared than than this time.
And certainly they were not. And students and alumni and parents alike are upset as to how this has been handled. And certainly they hope to move to a quick resolution. We don't know yet whether the NYPD might be involved or not. Mayor Adams yesterday had said Columbia had not asked for that. We will see if that changes in the hours ahead. It's obviously a developing story now. Richard, I do want to get to you what Jonathan just brought up a minute ago, which is the ongoing state of these hostage negotiations. We heard of Secretary of State Blinken was in Saudi Arabia yesterday. He said Israel had made a generous
exchange in phase one, then sort of a limited but unclear how long duration pause, and certainly in major military operations, possibly a complete ceasefire. But yes, the Israelis still want to move against Rafah, where you have the preponderance of Hamas fighters, as well as probably half the Gazan population. The administration is trying to work this hostage for prisoner swap, get a ceasefire. If they can't, the fallback of the administration is saying, okay, we don't particularly want you to go into Rafah, but if you're going to go in, do it in a measured, calibrated way. Use force in a much more discriminating way than you've used for the preponderance of the last 6-7 months. So there's lots of negotiations going on with Hamas, with Israel, almost on various contingencies. That's where we stand. And my guess is this will become clear in the next couple of days. Here we are essentially coming up at the 7-month point of this. But let me say one last thing. However this works itself out over the next couple of days and weeks, you're still going to have some of the same fundamental questions. Yeah. Who's going to govern Gaza? Who's going to occupy it? What about the Palestinians on the West Bank? Where do we go from here? Is there a political dimension to Israeli policy? Joe was talking about settlements a minute ago. What about settler violence? What about Israel's willingness to stop expropriating land? Are the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, willing and able to step up to be a partner for peace? So all of these issues are going to come back once we see what happens over the next few days.
All right. Jonathan Greenblatt, to close, I just want to start where we began, which is on the campus of Columbia University. You have students, you have outside agitators, and you have a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about. So within the realm of that, what should Columbia do? If you could tell them right now how to handle this, what's the solution?
I would say President Shafiq. Listen to the people around you, not to the radical fringe. President Shafiq, number one, none of us support the use of excessive force, but coordinate with law enforcement and get those protesters out of those buildings and retake the campus for all your students once and for all, number one. Number two, no concessions to terrorists. These kids are telling you they, quote, want to burn Columbia down, like Chancellor Dearmeyer, who Willie mentioned before. Suspend and expel the kids who are trying to destroy the institution. And number three, President Shafiq, no masking on campus. Kids who conceal their identities, as Jonathan said, many of them are outside agitators, professional protesters. They are going in there and they are destroying Columbia University for the, to the detriment of everyone. Your Jewish students need you. All your students need you. The broader Columbia community needs you. So President Shafiq, again, get into law enforcement, consequences, not concessions, and no more masking, whether it's KKK or Proud Boys or SJP.
CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. Jonathan, thanks for being here this morning. Thanks. And guys, as we head to break here, just a quick statement last night from the University of Florida, which says it patiently allowed students to protest for many days, warned them that eventually they'd be trespassing. They arrested a handful of students and sent out this statement, quote, "This is not complicated. The University of Florida is not a daycare, and we do not treat protesters like children. They knew the rules, they broke the rules, and now they will face the consequences." That's from the University of Florida.
Makes a lot of sense. Still ahead on Morning Joe, we'll talk about what to expect when Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial resumes in a Manhattan courtroom in just a few hours from now. Plus, Hunter Biden puts Fox News on notice. What we're learning about a plan to sue the cable network for its coverage of the president's son. You're watching Morning Joe. We're back in 60 seconds.
At Consumer Cellular, you get the same exact coverage as the largest carriers for up to half the price. That's amazing. And great customer service based here in America. That's amazing. And no hidden fees, no contracts, and free activation. That's Hello? Barbara? Sorry, I was muted. That's amazing. I know, right?
Barbara, did you see that?
Live look at Capitol Hill on a beautiful morning in Washington, D.C. It's 39 past the hour. More than 50 U.S. mayors are in Washington this week to discuss efforts to combat homelessness at the federal level. Joining us now, Democratic Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles. She's the chair of the U.S. Conference of Mayors Task Force on Homelessness, and Republican Mayor David Holt of Oklahoma City.
So, Mayor Bass, let me begin with you. Thank you all both so much for being with us. You know, over the past few years, I've spoken with mayors of major cities, mainly across the Northeast, but some on the West Coast, and ask, why can't you take care of the homelessness problem? Why does it keep spreading? And they always would allude to these lower court rulings that didn't give them the authority to take care of the homeless crisis in their own towns. It looks like the Supreme Court is going to give that power back to the mayors, back to local officials, to have a holistic approach, the way that works best in their own communities. Is that good news for you?
Oh, well, I don't think that it's helpful, frankly, is to see people are not refusing to be housed. They don't want to be on the street. And so I think giving cities the power to arrest people or to ticket people does not solve the problem.
Well, it doesn't solve the problem, Mayor Holt, but is it at least a good first step for you to be able to have more control of your situation?
Well, as a general rule, of course, mayors want local control, but as Mayor Bass said, I mean, you are not going to arrest or incarcerate or ticket your way out of a homelessness issue. And that's one of the toughest things to accept when you deal with this very intractable problem is you've got to bring wraparound services. People have come into homelessness 1,000 different ways. You kind of have to have 1,000 different options to get them out of it. So I would say it's a lot more complicated than that because, you know, it's easy to clear an encampment and move people on, but if you're not getting them into housing and then getting them the support, you know, the job training, the substance abuse, the mental health services that they need, they're not going to stay off the street.
Mayor Bass, Los Angeles has had a long-running problem with homelessness and people on the street at Skid Row and elsewhere, so this certainly didn't start with your administration, but you're in the hot seat now. What sort of measurable progress have you made, can you make in the foreseeable future to get people off the street and to get them housed?
Well, first of all, we absolutely have to have a comprehensive solution because we can get people off the street and then more come on the street. But we have to develop a system of long-term interim housing while we are building, and we're doing exactly that. So I've signed executive directives that fast-track building. You know, Los Angeles over the years has become extremely expensive to live in, so we have to address the supply of housing. We have to have a place for people to go while housing is being built and the wraparound services that Mayor Holt talked about. If we do not address this in a comprehensive manner, we're not going to succeed. And just to be clear, in Los Angeles, we're talking about in the city, we're talking about 46,000 people who are unhoused. And so we can make a measurable difference, but we have to operate from several different perspectives. And that's why we're here in D.C. right now. We're trying to address a problem with veterans being unhoused. Veterans should not have to choose between their benefits and housing. So that's the specific issue that over 40 mayors are here addressing on the Hill today.
Mayor Holt, good morning. As you know, and you mentioned, so much of this gets back to mental health and mental illness of people on the streets and circumstances that have brought him there. So how do you get better than we are now at the root cause of homelessness, or at least one of the most prominent?
Right, and I should give a lot of credit to the organization that Mayor Bass and I are a part of, because that's a high point of emphasis this year, in addition to homelessness, is mental health. I mean, we just have to invest in it at every level. You know, what caused a lot of what we see today, it's not the only cause, but, you know, 50, 60 years ago, this country made a decision for all the right reasons to kind of close the institutions. The problem was that really wasn't replaced with anything. And so today, the streets and our jails and prisons have really replaced what was once the mental health institutions of this country. Local level, state level, federal level, everybody's got to make new investments in this issue. And you're right. I mean, it's not the only thing. There's, like I said, there's 1,000 different ways that people enter homelessness, but mental health is obviously a major contributor. And we as a society just have not invested in that enough. We have to do more.
Appreciate both of your focus on this issue. Mayor Bass, before we let you go, I want to ask you about the scenes we're seeing, and we were just discussing at the top of our show at both UCLA and USC, these campus protests over the war in Gaza. How do you think the schools have handled them?
Well, I think the schools have both schools have handled them the best that they can. But I will tell you that right now, both USC and UCLA are peaceful. I know that the